Hi there. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Ryan Nobles in Washington, where it is tax day, and the Trump administration is trying to shift the narrative back to its affordability agenda, even as the war with Iran drags on, pushing prices higher for consumers. White House officials today touting the tax savings from the president's big, beautiful bill, as the president once again projects optimism that the war is almost over.
Well, you keep saying was. Is this war over?
I think it's close to over, yeah. I mean, I view it as very close to over. You know what? If I pulled up stakes right now, it would take them 20 years to rebuild that country. And we're not finished. We'll see what happens. I think they want to make a deal very badly.
The president also backtracking on his recent comments that energy prices could go up heading into the midterms, now saying he expects that gas prices will be lower come November. Treasury Secretary Besant echoing that optimism from the White House podium today.
So when are we really going to get $3 a gallon gas?
Well, I think that's going to be the up to how the negotiations go. President Trump said this morning that he thinks we're nearing the end. The U.S. kept their side on the ceasefire. We've stopped firing. The Straits of Hormuz have not been completely reopened, so we will see. And I'm optimistic that during the summer we will see gas with a 3 in front of it sooner rather than later. I'm optimistic that sometime between June 20th and September 20th that we can have $3 gas again.
Gas prices right now remain above $4 a gallon and are up significantly since the start of the war. As for the status of those peace negotiations between the U.S. and Iran, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt saying the talks are ongoing and the administration feels good about the prospects of a deal. Meanwhile, the U.S. military continues to enforce a naval blockade of Iranian ports. The Pentagon saying that 9 vessels were turned around in the first 48 hours of the blockade and that no ships made it past U.S. forces. Iran's army responding with a threat of its own, saying it could block maritime traffic around the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea if the U.S. blockade continues. Now, this all comes as new polling showing the war increasingly becoming a political liability for the president, with 60% of Americans saying they disapprove of the U.S. military's strikes on Iran. 51% say the war with Iran has not been worth it. That's compared to just 24% who say the war has been worthwhile. As for the economic impact, 63% of Americans say they think that gas prices will only get worse over the next year because of the war, and 54% saying the war has had a negative impact on their personal financial situation. And this is pretty remarkable. Virtually no one saying that it's had a positive impact. Joining me now from the White House is NBC's Kelly O'Donnell, and NBC News Chief International Correspondent Keir Simmons is in Saudi Arabia. So, Kelly, let's start with you. It feels as though we've been talking about these potential talks, the outcome of these talks for weeks now with no discernible progress. What can we make of this latest round, especially considering that the ceasefire is now set to expire in just 6 days?
Well, Ryan, I think that's a pressure point. The ceasefire expiration is one of the things that is causing some of that urgency, where the administration is saying they're open to having talks again within a matter of days, and yet no talks are scheduled. That is also notable. The kind of positive tone that we're hearing from the president, from the Treasury Secretary, seems to be a willing it into being more than having specific facts that are able to tell us where things stand. It is true that the ceasefire has held. There is still great conflict about how the Strait of Hormuz will return to the kind of traffic that it was able to support prior to this hostile conflict with Iran. So there is a sense that that ceasefire deadline is one pressure point. The desire to reopen conversations, they went for about 21 hours in Pakistan the other day. Can they have enough in terms of the conditions to bring about a next set of issues? We know the U.S. offered about a 20-year minimum for Iran to agree to not pursue a nuclear weapon. Iran countered with a 3 to 5 year window. Neither of those were acceptable to the parties. So where does that leave us next? We don't exactly know. But the positioning for talks seems to be in place, but actually going forward and setting it has not yet occurred. Right?
Yeah, and everything you're talking about right now seems incremental, Kelly, not anywhere near finality. But the president continues to say, he's been saying for a while, that he expects the war will be over soon. Do we have any idea what gives him that confidence?
This seems to be where the president is trying to will events into being by the fact, as commander-in-chief, he would know whether he intends to restart more hostile activity toward Iran. He has talked about that. He has threatened various things. But there isn't a specific thing, except the president saying he believes it to be so. Congress, of course, has been urging the president to try to be more, at least Democrats in Congress, to provide more information. There are those in Congress who would like to see constraints on the president's use of force if it goes beyond an initial operation and into a territory where Congress believes it should exert its authority. So there are pressure points, and the economic numbers that you talked about with gas prices and so forth, that's another point. So there are pressure areas, but what will move the ball considerably is still to be determined, right?
And, of course, the president is supposed to head to China next month. He's already delayed this trip once, but it comes as U.S. intel is suggesting that Beijing could send Iran air defense weaponry. Is the president at all concerned about the optics of this trip, given everything at stake here?
Well, publicly, he's not. He's been asked about that. The White House has been asked about it. Clearly, the ties, longstanding ties between China and Iran are well known. The president indicating that he has communicated with President Xi of China, saying not to be supportive of Iran, not to send new weapon systems or other kinds of aid. The president saying that he takes President Xi at his word that he will not do that, despite the fact that there is intelligence to suggest that China has aided and would aid Iran. That makes for a very complicated visit to China. The president clearly wants to go. China is always a complex adversary and economic counterweight in the world, and their presence certainly in line with a country the U.S. is fighting, Iran, makes that much more difficult. The president wants to make this visit. Can conditions make that so, and will China cooperate?
All right, let's get the view from the region. Kelly, thank you so much for that. Keir, we'll go to you now in Saudi Arabia. Pakistan's prime minister is where you are in Saudi Arabia now. What do we know about those meetings? Is there any confidence that Pakistan could actually broker a deal between the U.S. and Iran?
I think it's an indication, and you heard Kelly setting out, this is the view from Washington there. I think it's an indication that there's actually an awful lot of work to do, and that the Pakistanis recognize that. And the Pakistani Prime Minister here in Riyadh to meet with Saudi Arabian officials is just one of a number of visits that he's going to make. He's going to be in Turkey to talk to the officials there, also to Qatar. But there are lots and lots of conversations happening. And frankly, that is because the gap between the Americans and the Iranians is wider than the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, there really are a number of issues that are huge. And just as an example of that hasn't been talked about so much, when you heard the vice president over the past few days talk about the offer from the Trump administration to Iran to join America in kind of a trade capitalist wonderful future, you can't underestimate the extent to which the Iranian regime might not want that might not think that that's actually in their interest, might think that something like that could be in the long term a threat to them. I mean, that's just one example. Aside from the question of Iran's insistence that it should, as a matter of pride, be allowed to continue to have uranium, even if it's in small quantities and small distillations, and its determination to try to have some kind of control of the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, it goes on and on and on. And all of that has to be figured out. And so far, despite the vice president saying, listen, I spent more than 20 hours in Islamabad, it's taken months, years to negotiate other kinds of similar deals.
And you talk about the complications around the Strait. Now Iran is threatening to block all traffic around the Gulf. They're even potentially extending blockades into the Red Sea. What kind of implications would there be for these Gulf countries that have not stood in the way of this operation, but seem to be getting increasingly uncomfortable with how long it's going on?
Yeah, I mean, it's had Gulf nations desperately worried. And frankly, any country that relies on this region for its oil and gas and other petrochemicals and things desperately worried. Just as an example, the Saudis here, Saudi Arabia has a pipeline from the east of the country to the west of the country that gets you to the Red Sea there, the Bab al-Mandeb, that area that you're talking about. That carries about 7 million barrels of oil a day. The Strait of Hormuz normally takes around 20 million barrels a day. So you can imagine, you can see just how important that pipeline is. It was actually attacked by the Iranians last week. And so if Iran was able to carry out that kind of a threat and block that area of the Red Sea, as well as the Strait of Hormuz, it would be a catastrophe on top of a crisis. That being said, the man who said this, Ali Abdelaziz, who's a commander in the Iranian military, I mean, he is speaking, but he isn't necessarily speaking as the leadership of Iran. So it's a threat, but it's not necessarily what Iran wants to carry out. I still think that both the Iranians and the Trump administration really would like to get to a deal here. The real problem is, what deal?
Right. And it's also complicated by many other factors, including Israel's role in all of this, which we didn't have time to get into. But Keir Simmons,
that's right.
Thank you for your reporting in Saudi Arabia. We appreciate it, as always. And as we mentioned, gas prices remain in the $4 range as Americans continue to bear the cost of this war. Despite that, the S&P and NASDAQ both reached a new record high today as investors appear to be largely shaking off concerns about the war. And joining me now, I'm pleased to introduce the newly named chief business correspondent and the anchor of the new and up-and-coming 10 a.m. and 11 a.m. hours here on NBC News Now, Christine Romans. Christine, I couldn't be more happy for you and our viewers that you're taking on this new role. Congratulations. This is very exciting.
Ryan. Thank you so much, Ryan.
But part of the reason you got this job is because you're so smart about these topics. So let's talk about what's going on in the markets. The S&P and NASDAQ both hitting an all-time high today. You and I have had these conversations a lot. There are all these indications that tell us that there is volatility in the world, but investors seem to just be shaking it off. Why aren't they more concerned with what's happening in Iran?
Well, a couple of things. I mean, the U.S. economy is so resilient and has been for several years. I mean, it has really shaken off a lot of big shocks from tariffs, quite frankly, now to higher energy costs. And so it shows you that companies, remember, Wall Street reflects how companies are doing, and U.S. companies are doing quite well here. The better thing to watch, I think, is the more tangible market, and that right now happens to be the oil market. Watching when the oil markets go up because they're concerned about the supply of oil, when they go down because they think that there could be some kind of a resolution. So just look at how far these big, important commodities have gone since the war began. You can just see sort of the depth of all of this.
Mm-hmm. The president backtracked on his comments about the possibility that oil prices would remain high going into the midterms. But do administration officials share that optimism? And what steps are they doing to try and make sure the prices come down?
You know, they have tried to move the levers they can, but this is a big, complicated global oil market. And when there's a choking off of supply in one part of the world, like the Strait of Hormuz, it raises prices for everyone. You know, I talked to Kevin Hassett, who's one of the president's advisors, and I asked him, you know, how concerned are you? What is your message to the American people about gas prices that surveys show they are very concerned about high gas prices? This is what he told me.
We're very sensitive to the fact that gas prices are higher. They've gone from 3-ish to 4-ish on average in the country, and that's something that we're all in on addressing by doing things like releasing the strategic reserve and increasing production in Venezuela and in the U.S. and so on. We understand that people are frustrated with the higher prices, and the people expect them to go back down. If you look at futures markets, they're expecting this to be over soon and for prices to go way back down.
I mean, the message today we heard from Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, as well, is that prices will go back, into the $3 range sometime this summer. So they're trying to project optimism that oil prices and gas prices will come down. And they also keep talking about things in the tax code, the other things that they're doing that they say are putting money in people's pockets. So trying to sort of tell that story.
Mm-hmm. Let's turn now to the controversy around the Federal Reserve. NBC's Julie Sirkin spoke to Senator Tom Tillis. He currently has a hold on Kevin Warsh's confirmation process. He would be the new Fed chairman once Jerome Powell exits the stage. Listen to what Tillis told Julie.
I'm not going to support movement out of the committee. I don't think that there's any path outside of my vote. I doubt any Democrats will be voting for him. Kevin's a perfect candidate, and that's why it's so frustrating that somebody in DOJ in February decided that they were going to maybe garner favor from somebody in the White House by trying to invoke a criminal investigation against Jerome Powell for 2 minutes of testimony in a banking hearing where 7 Republican members have all publicly said no crime was committed, including the chair of the banking committee. Now, some people can say, okay, Tom, you made your point. Jay Powell's term expires as chair in May, so why not go ahead and fill it? Because I don't want to reward bad behavior.
So this comes as President Trump is now threatening to fire the Fed chair, Jerome Powell. What kind of upheaval could this cause at the central bank?
I mean, what a political firestorm. This has been remarkable to watch here. The President of the United States publicly feuding with the head of the Federal Reserve, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, and the person who's been, named to maybe have that job when Jay Powell is done with his term, held up because of the behavior of the Department of Justice with a probe that some senators think is this has just been remarkable. This has been great upheaval. And what's interesting to me is that the Fed chief has really doubled down on the integrity of the Fed, the independence of the Fed, and trying to just navigate through what has been all of this noise around. We've got a Fed meeting coming up, in just a couple of weeks here. The last Fed chief as chair, we think of, for Jerome Powell, with all this noise still swirling around. I've never seen a transition at the Fed like it before. It has been really remarkable. And
it's not over yet. Christine Romans.
It's not over.
Thanks again. Congrats on your new assignment and your new show. We'll be watching. Coming up, we'll have more of NBC's exclusive interview with Republican Senator Tom Tillis as he speaks out on the state of Republican politics, the war with Iran, and who he says is giving President Trump bad advice. But first, the Swalwell scandal reverberates through Washington and beyond as another criminal investigation is launched into action. And Democrats race to distance themselves from the disgraced former congressman. A top House Democrat from California responds. Next, you're watching Meet the Press Now.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.